Cool, thanks. Thank you for introducing me. Uh, Hello, everyone. My name's Kathy, and I am a full stack developer at Pinterest, and we are here to learn about React Native today in this session. So as part of just FYIs, I'm going to do the speech with the assumption that the majority talk about things generally with the assumption that you know about, view controllers, the whole MVC paradigms, and I think if either you've built a web app or a mobile app, you'll be able to follow through. There is a standard Pinterest policy going on where we're not setting up time for Q&A after, but if during this talk you have questions about, if you need me to repeat a point or if you want me to elaborate on something, I'm perfectly happy to do that. And I'll share these slides out afterwards. So my background is in mostly full stack, but a large part of that is web. So just desktop web from learning HTML, CSS, Django apps from when I started to code in college. And then at Pinterest, I started learning React. I got more into iOS development and general full stack experience. And then within the past few months, I've been working pretty much most of my time on our React features. So I'm going to start with a little background to what is React Native? What's the motivation around this? Oh, no. This is a little thing I have to tell me to not stare at my computer for too long. My bad. Forgot to turn that off. All right, so the whole motivation is people want to do things like build apps that run on both iOS and Android. The whole idea of let's code something once and have it run on multiple platforms. Let's code something and have something built very quickly so that we don't have to wait for let's hire a developer per stack and wait for all those things to sync up. And so before React Native was around, I don't know, maybe some of you have heard of things like Cordova or PhoneGap, where they basically are sort of beefed up web views, and that, as well as just standard web views, are how people would say, if you have web code that you want to deploy in a mobile app, you were able to do that. And so that was a pretty common solution back in the day. And the issues with that were you had to deal with things like pretty much loading a whole web app within your mobile app, and you have to deal with browser compatibility and those standards of the web within mobile and the performance of loading that and having that whole intermediate piece in your app. So that was what existed. And so React Native came around. And what React Native does differently is that they render using native mobile components. So instead of loading in a web app, it is sort of compiled to native iOS, native Android code. And in this talk, I'm not going to go too much into the mechanics of it. There are tons of great talks on the internet from other conferences that I have linked in this presentation that will go into the deep dive of how their JavaScript engine works. And it's super interesting, but it's a separate topic to cover. Essentially, what we're covering today is how it's used, the practicalities of it, our experience with it, and the benefits of it. But yeah, effectively, React Native is much faster than PhoneGap, much faster than WebViews. A lot of performance benchmark texts. I've linked to some of them in these slides too. They show that a lot of React Native apps do perform about the same speed as apps written in Swift or in Android, which is pretty incredible. And it's pretty incredible that this technology is just available to us in this day. And let's see. Yeah, so this is a brief diagram of how code is structured. It's very similar to if you have worked in React, you pretty much are writing the same code. You're writing React components, you're using state, render, etc. You're writing JavaScript. And it works in the same way where that's run, your components are built and run, and the only difference is that on React Native, they are compiled to native code. Cool. So what's also really interesting about it is that there are multiple ways to either inject React Native into your existing app or build a whole new one. So if you want to, say if you're a web developer and you want to jump into mobile app development, you can just start off with just that knowledge and kickstart your app. So this is an example it's a very common GitHub project called Create React Native App that you just sort of clone and you run like yarn start or something, and there is a dev environment already set up for you to play with. So it's so quick to start if you're an existing web developer, you want to get into mobile. And what I would like to talk about is that even if you want to work on, say, an existing mobile app, say your company has a iOS app out and you want to build on top of that, but you don't know iOS or you don't know mobile at all, then you can actually integrate React Native into that pretty easily. And it's a pretty common practice at Pinterest. It's also common. Instagram does it. Airbnb does it. They list a lot of big companies that do it on their website. And that is the way I will talk about it today. So at Pinterest, we use React Native for a lot of things within our native apps. And here I've listed a bunch of examples. We try to use it on features that we want to do a lot of iteration on and that we want to ship very quickly. So go ahead. Oh, yeah, I can get into that. Should I get into that now? I can jump ahead. No, I think we can talk about it twice, but the deployment process of that it's pretty much, you can do one of two things. So if you write React Native code, what we do here at Pinterest is that our code is bundled daily and then committed into each of our native repos, which are then each release of our iOS app and our Android apps are released to the App Store, and we normally do that weekly. And there is another way called OTA, over-the-air deployment, where it's more similar to a continuous web deployment. That is considered something that people are philosophically supportive of because it increases your ability to fix things, to release more, but it is risky in terms of having your native iOS code sync with your React Native code. Think of it as when you do things like change around an API and change around things that communicate with each other remotely. There's that risk of things being out of sync, if that makes sense. Cool. I'm going to go back to the beginning, my slides. Oh no. All right. So yeah, let's go through first what we use React Native at Pinterest and what we found. We found the use case of React Native to be the most beneficial. So like I said, it's a lot of features that need to be built very quickly that we might change 1 week, 1 month to the other. So something here like our sign-up flow and our first user experience, we have a lot of growth thinking around that. We're like, okay, we need to show them different experiences. We need to experiment with what is the most useful to someone using Pinterest for the first time, what gets the most signups, engagement, etc., which is why we've built it in React Native. We have certain other low usage features in React Native that, again, are pretty, let's see, there are things that we change a lot, like the settings page. We do need to add to that a lot, configure things. And one thing that was the project that I was working on, so I'm on the ads team, and what we released this year is our mobile ads experience. And for that was something that we wanted to ship very quickly. We wanted it to be available on both iOS and Android at the same time. And we have essentially in our ads team more web developers, people with that web experience that we want to utilize that experience to build on this platform. And a little background on this project to explain it a little bit more, it's on the profile page of Pinterest. You have a little card for your ad metrics that you can click in, and when you click into that, the view on the right is our React Native ads tools. So that's the combination of native code and React Native code. And as background on motivation on the project is that we did a lot of this very quickly. We started planning it last December, and then within the past 3 months, we built a lot of the screens from scratch. We had to build a lot of the connecting parts from the native to React Native environment and shipped the whole feature last week, actually. So that's one of the major benefits of this technology. We were able to move very quickly in comparison to doing this if we wanted to try to build Android, iOS separately. And so this goes over the points of consideration of, when should I use React Native? So like I said, if you had a lot of iterations, you need to run a lot of A/B experiments, and if you need to have both platforms available immediately to users, and if you don't have, how do I explain this? If you don't have very, very specific performance needs, like I've said, React Native is pretty performant in comparison to most use cases for native code, and there are some cases where you need to do very custom things. For example, the Pinterest home feed, you have a zillion images, you have a zillion animations going on. And so that one, regardless, aside from the fact that, aside from the debate of whether to use React Native for something like that, something that you need high performance on, you probably already need to do very custom performance-related workarounds for that. But that is a consideration to think about. Cool. So now that I've set up that whole introduction, we can start talking about more of the dev environment. So things like deploys and things like how we work on what we work on day to day and what are the tools, the environment we've had to set up. And yeah, so like I said, our React Native environment is that combination one. We don't have any pure React Native app, but we do have it set up so that you can build new views, new features within React Native, within our Objective-C code base, our Objective-C app, and our Android app. And so what we've had to spend some engineering time building the foundation of is the bridge connecting those two, connecting the native environments and the React Native environments. And so as I've showed here, what you see on the left screen where you see that See More button, that is the entry point that navigates to a React Native view. So the left one is native iOS, the right one is built-in React Native. And as you can see, they look very similar. And if you go on the app, if you go through any of the things like sign-up flow, everything, it all feels very similar. Yeah, so React Native views, the way we handle navigations is that each native view is nested within each React view is nested within a mobile view. So there is the iOS view controller that is created for this right view, and within that we we instantiate a React Native view. And by doing that, oh, go ahead.
So you basically aren't using like a navigation library, like a React Native navigation library, using either the Java or the Objective-C navigation to navigate to a pointer to this React Native code inside of your native code.
Yeah. And so the reason why we do that is because we have this combination and because there are things you have to consider with deep linking, with routing and the view stacks, it was much easier to use the existing native iOS navigation libraries, navigation logic, instead of trying to combine the two. Oh, go ahead. Oh, so what it means is that when you need to make a change to something like the entry point button, the See More button that navigates to the React Native view, we have to build that in natively in both iOS and Android. But anything we make to this right screen, it's just one code base. The right screen is our React Native code base. Cool, good questions. So how do we do this communication? Aside from this architecture, this inheritance style, how do we do these sort of back and forth? And there are two main concepts, two main tools that you can use that are existing React Native tools supported by the Facebook dev team, the entire open source project. And the first one I'll be talking about is native modules. So basically, if you need to do things such as if you need to show toasts and you don't want to rebuild it, you can use existing native code and have that connected to your React Native code. And so for here, this toast is native iOS, even though the view is React Native. And the way you do that is you use this standard component from the open source React Native library. You basically just extend it. You define the interface for showing a toast that you use within JavaScript. And then what you label in your native iOS code base is you just say, oh, when the React Native environment wants a PI React Native Toast Manager, this points to actually the native iOS Toast Manager. So all you really need to do is a few lines of configuration. And we use native modules for a lot of the connecting points. One of the main benefits are things like that, where there are a few UI tools we can reuse, but we also can reuse the API clients of handling, fetching, submitting data. And the reason we do this is because since those are already existing in both our iOS and Android code bases, there's no need for us to write like a whole new React Native API client. Cool. So the other important thing to know when you're doing that connection between native and React is the whole event bridge toolset. And this is basically just a communication channel. It's saying, okay, if you have some sort of callback, some sort of handler within React Native, and you need to communicate that to your iOS code, you can simply emit an event, and then you will have a similar library within iOS that receives the event and does an action on it. So for this example, what I've shown you here is that on the left screen, you're entering into the right screen's React Native environment. And then in the React Native environment, when you need to do something like you're creating another ad or you're adding more money to your ad that you're running, you can then emit a event bridge event that will update your native iOS screen. So as you can see on the left, you can emit an event that will update the amount spent in your native code. So Event Bridge and native modules, those are ways of communicating back and forth. And here is a lot of boxes that show the overall architecture of how this all works together. And should have put this on different slides. So on the left and on the right are more or less pretty standard MVC type app architecture. Basically, you have your view controllers, they communicate to your API client and your network, and they handle a view. On the right, where you see pure React Native, you have your React Native code that generates native components. That's the main difference. And within Pinterest, when you think about integrating the two, it's effectively you use things like the event bridges, like the native modules to communicate back and forth. And you just simply combine them by having those communication links, as well as just having the standard, you're putting React Native code within and you're generating a native view with that. Yeah, if you have more questions on this whole setup, feel free to ask, or feel free to ask afterwards.
I've got a question. Do you
Sure.
find that this architecture gives you advantages? Do you develop faster because you have like these different separations of components?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So, oh no. So we had to spend a lot of time thinking about things like, okay, so what are we building with the React Native environment versus what are we reusing? And we've decided like, okay, we're not going to rebuild an API client. We're not going to rebuild some standard modules some standard UI components that are there. And so that's kind of where we draw the lines of blue versus yellow. And because of that, we also have separate code bases for if a view is in React Native, it's in the React Native code base. And when it comes to being able to develop, there's actually separate development servers so that when we need to do live reloading, update a line of code in that, it doesn't reload the entire mobile code environment. By that I mean when we need to update a line in a React Native view, that React Native environment is updated instead of having to rerun the entire iOS app. And I think the next slides are about that too, actually. So that was a good segue. Yes. Cool. So this is another big benefit of having React Native at Pinterest, is that we have that separations of concerns, and because of that, we have those separations of dev environments. So like I mentioned, when we need to do live reloading, when we need to update our code, it updates only that view. So it takes only 2 seconds instead of the build running for around 15 seconds. Also, because of that, because we're doing React Native instead of something like PhoneGap, something like a web view, we're not building our entire desktop web app, which has a lot of things. So that also cuts down our build time. Cool. And to go over certain just logistics, when we think about things like, oh, what should we put in that dev environment, what dependencies, they're pretty similar to what we use in our desktop environment. So that's another thing that's also pretty useful. If you have an existing web app that your company works on, that you work on, and you want to build something very similar, you can just sort of think about the architecture, think about the dependencies very similarly. So for example, we use both Redux, React in our React Native apps as well, React Native views as well as on Pinterest.com. We use this UI library called Gestalt. It's actually this open source UI component library from Pinterest, but we use those in both desktop and React Native. So that's another plus. is that you have that ability to reuse your web code. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I haven't done a lot. I'm a React Native developer, but I haven't done a lot of native code. So my question was going to be kind of about, and I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but do you then, like, you have your React Native project, do you, like, make it into some sort of, like, thing that you can link into your native modules, or how are you importing those JavaScript files into the native code?
Oh, so I don't have that set up too much as part of this talk, but effectively it's a node server that's run, and it's run within your native iOS, native Android environments. And there's just certain like mechanics, certain just configuration steps that we can talk afterwards if you want to talk about how to set that up, the best practices for that. Yeah, so we have a pretty standard yarn package.json that looks very similar to what you see in a React app if you've built a React app before. And when we were building this dev environment and thinking about things in terms of, okay, we have existing desktop web tools and we have existing native tools, there are always going to be some things you have to work around. You have to figure out how to custom figure that out, because it is unfortunately just another dev environment. Like, not everything's going to fall in place perfectly. So we've had to build some glue to handle things like custom UI components, custom styles, to handle our context event logging, and to link up things for native modules for things like the API client and our A/B testing framework. Let me go over the slide again, just in case some of you understand this better with context. So there are two ways to deploy a React Native app. And the way we use at Pinterest is we do it within our regular app store releases. So we have daily jobs that take our existing React Native code base, commits it to a bundle that is committed to the Android and the iOS code base. And so those are just packaged within and submitted to their respective app stores. And as I've mentioned before, there's another method where you can do more live updates called OTA, over the air, but there are risks around that when it comes to making sure your native and your React Native code are in sync. But it's technology that Pinterest, Facebook, all of these companies have thought about doing, so maybe we'll do it in the future. Why not OTA? Okay. Cool. So with all our experience of building React Native features at Pinterest, I think it's important to just let you all know about things that you could watch out for. The two things being serialization and rendering. Serialization in terms of submitting API requests within the context of iOS and Android environments, since those are implemented differently in different languages. If I recall correctly, I don't do as much Android development as iOS, but I think this bug we've had to deal with was that we had to cast Booleans to either strings or integers when submitting API requests, because within the Android environment, because Android requires that. So that's a good thing to know. Another good thing to know is your UI components are not going to be rendered perfectly the same between iOS and Android. So it's always good to test on both platforms. Cool. So to summarize everything we talked about, I personally think React Native is a really great technology. We've benefited a lot from it at Pinterest. But there are things that are always good to ask yourself questions about when you're considering doing something like this. One being, okay, what are our existing engineering resources? Do we have enough engineers that know mobile, or do we potentially have engineers that know web that would want to jump into mobile, that would want to jump into this new technology. If your company has an existing web app, are you able to possibly reuse any of those libraries, reuse any of those third-party or company custom libraries for your React Native app? And if you do, that's pretty great because you don't have to write so much duplicate code. Will your work be extendable for other teams? So what has happened at Pinterest is that we started working on React Native a couple years ago, and it was kind of only for a few teams and a few features. Well, that has grown to be many developers have contributed to the tooling and the available libraries within that environment. And so we believe deeply in writing libraries, writing standard components within our dev environments so that other teams can move fast on the same platform. Oh. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say that the majority of our code on our mobile apps is still native because React Native is still a new-ish technology to the company. We've only started building new features on it within the past 1 or 2 years. But because of the benefits that, for example, the mobile ads tools that I've shown, for example, the sign-up flow, there are so many teams that have seen so many benefits from it that we're guessing that we're going to get a lot more features in React Native in the future. Oh, go ahead. For testing, let's see. So we use standard Jest unit tests similar to our desktop environment. And we have an integration test system set up. I personally don't know too much about it because I don't work with it. But if you're interested, I could try to point you to the right person. Yeah, so there are these considerations on, okay, what are our resources? What can we reuse already if you're deciding to build on React Native? There's also, if you are building a combination app, I understand that it's pretty rare, unless you work for a giant company and you're introducing React to your giant company for the first time, that you might not need to deal with this exact problem. But if you are combining native and React Native code, then it's worth thinking about that architecture of, okay, what is your bridge? What dependencies? What should we write in either environment? Cool. And these are the resources I talked about if you want to learn about how React Native works or learn more about the performance and other deep dives. Okay, last but not least, I want to give a big shout out to my team, Edward, Chong, Hwayang, and Kanan, who they're all they've all been working on that mobile ads tool that I mentioned. And a lot of them have done so much work in just spearheading the project, but also just spearheading the React Native dev culture and dev environment within Pinterest. So I wouldn't have been here talking in front of you without them, so I'm super grateful for them. And yeah, we're hiring at Pinterest. If you're interested in working on mobile, on React Native, please talk to me. You can contact me either through email or by DMing me on Twitter. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.